Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Angela Hendershot, Director of Operations for the FPC. A warm welcome to today's session, Expanding Access to Faster Payment Systems if you're not a bank. In this session, we will look at alternative ways to ride the rails of FedNow, TCH, RTP, Zelle, and other offerings for retail buyers and sellers, as well as subject matter experts and billers. It will delve into use cases for secure acceptance QR codes, A2A payment applications, P2P configurations, virtual network systems, and other means of one-day accessing the faster payment networks without having to be a bank. I would like to now introduce our presenters. Maria Arminio of Avenue B Consulting is working with the FPC to help facilitate the deliverables process across several work groups and provide technical expertise and support in the design, development, and completion of workgroup deliverables. Maria is core to our work groups and their tremendous impact on the industry with recent and upcoming publications. Our next presenter, Steve Mott, International Bon Vivant, Fed groupie and consultant extraordinaire, now a board member of the FPC, and in his spare time dedicates his expertise to our workgroup efforts. With that, I'd like to now turn it over to you, Steve.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this session. Maria and I have been working together for too long to even describe in years on many different alternative payment mechanisms and different ways on how people transact and how they deal with risk and those kinds of things. We both got oriented toward faster payments when the task forces kicked off in 2015. And we've continued to scratch our heads and think about what is this path to faster payments and what does it really mean? So we both signed up for the Faster Payments Council and have done, as you heard, a number of things to try and support that. But one of the things we thought for the member meeting this time was to try and put a little bit of maybe a broader scope to what we're thinking about or talking about with faster payments. And in particular, address some of the things that are nearest and dearest to our hearts, including security and standards and interoperability and those kinds of things, and how they play in this broader vision of what faster payments really are as we see them. So the session today is expanding access to faster payment systems if you're not a bank. And what we're really trying to say is maybe not think so much in such a dominant way about how banks think about this, but how bank customers think about this, how users think about it. So as the session description indicated, we're looking at how to ride the rails, particularly because we're focused now so much on FedNow, TCH, RTP, Zelle, and other offerings, and for retail buyers and sellers perspective, but also for small businesses and billers who seem to have a lot at stake in how this all plays out. And so we're looking at things about secure acceptance of QR codes, A2A payment applications, particularly in the open banking frameworks that have emerged in Europe and other areas and are making their way to the US, P2P configurations, and what call in a colloquial way virtual network systems. They have a lot more to do with infrastructure than what the rails are that you're really trying to execute the settlement of the payment. And the idea of how you could actually access these kinds of systems in a reliable and comfortable and efficient way without having necessarily be a bank. And so the intent is to try and draw out some viewpoints from attendees in the QA session at the end. And the first one that we think is an example of something I might want to talk about is, do we have a broad enough lexicon and purview of what faster payments really means, particularly from the user standpoint? Because there are all these different kinds of things, as we'll talk about very quickly today, that enter into all the viewpoint of users as to what a faster or real-time payment actually can be and is. And they're signing up for a lot of these alternative mechanisms very, very quickly. Secondly, from the standpoint of the FPC membership, are there minimum and security and data protection and sharing standards necessary to help guide users across a multitude of choices? Obviously, we're not trying to pick winners or losers, but it's probably going to be important for users to be able to discern, not in the way that we have over the last few years, because we've focused on this so much, but in a more colloquial way, how to decide what would be the best real-time payment service be most appropriate for a particular user. And more importantly, now that we're in a new payment paradigm, can we actually do authentication right so that we can manage the risk and get to something that the digital world seems to crave and is happening in a lot of other places, but not so much here in the US so far. So those are just three. There may be other inputs that the folks on the session might like to have. We welcome them at the end of the session. Next slide, please. So from a very high level, here's how we're thinking about this. So faster payments are clearly proliferating and growing globally with thanks to a push from COVID over the past year, where people really are ready to start changing some of their physical payment habits and preferences. But the growing presence of real-time payment systems, and there's an ACI study that I'll refer to several times in my part of the presentation. There are more than 85 different systems out there in 79 countries. And that's not counting all the peripheral ones, the new ones that really don't get into the count as a formal payment system with some imprimatur of a central bank sponsored service or government sponsored service, as many of them do feature from a bank to bank perspective. So these other forms of faster payment will have users, already have users, in some cases are lighting up the boards with users, consumers, businesses, and others. And they're finding their way to these alternative real-time payments, not necessarily the way that I think we think about it in the bank perspective as how do you market the service? How would you market? How has TCH RTP market itself? How has FedNow market itself? More importantly, what is the natural value proposition that resonates with different types of users? And how does that get communicated? And I think an effective means of being able to do that is probably going to foster good, solid acceptance in adoption, more so than sort of a pedantic description of, okay, you can do this and the funds clear in 10 minutes and your liability is XYZ. There's got to be better ways to communicate what the value proposition are. And we think some of the non-banks who are finding their ways to become providers, these are payment system providers of various ilks, are going to be doing that kind of front-end marketing. And not just for the formal real-time payment systems, but for a lot of the newer ones as well. And as a result, we're going to, I think, as FPC, as a body, need to address what are the infrastructure changes that will be required, not within a given faster payment system per se, but with respect to how do users find their way to a common understanding of, is this really a good one for small payments? Is this one really good for moving a $10 million wire transfer to a B2B type of transaction? And how do you discern and sort those out? Next slide, please. So at a high level, that what we're really trying to get at is, do we know more about the marketplace that isn't represented by the logos that are on this slide? So we know a lot about RTP. They opened the marketplace up a couple of years ago. Zelle is a extension and potentially a companion rail. A lot of things Zelle could be with RTP. Visa Direct and MasterCard Send are in the background as default ways when you can't get to the bank directly to be able to move that payment. FedNow is coming and has a pretty hardcore marketing proposition behind them. I think it's some of us are a little surprised at how ardent the Fed is about trying to communicate what they think this is all about, and not just been there for a while working with expanding same day ACH, and they express great satisfaction with the kind of growth and acceptance that they've gotten there. So we know all about that stuff, and we know pretty much kind of the users and some of the value propositions, but there's more to it. Next slide, please. And it's that more to it that we're trying to get our hands around, because This stuff's happening. And again, a lot of this is from this ACI report that came out in March, a lot faster than most people think. Total number of real-time transactions, 70 billion, up 41%. Real-time share of global electronic transactions, 9.8%, up 7.6%. Value of real-time transactions up 32.8%. Wallet adoption is exploding, of course, led by China and now by India as well. But there's the creeping concern about payments fraud that still is working its way into the conversation. And while people, and particularly users, may not be as savvy and as oriented toward that, Maria and I have some questions about that we'd like to address along the way here about what that is going to mean in terms of infrastructure changes and standards and the role of authentication. As ACI says, people are making their way to whatever the new channel is. Next slide, please. So interestingly, the way ACI counts the real-time payment transactions, we're in 9th place. We're ahead of Mexico. We're on the board anyway, but we're clearly behind some of the huge adopting markets like China and India. But I think it's good that we're on the board. And you think about 2015 when the Fed really announced faster payments, and shortly after TCH and real-time payment platform came out. I'm not sure people thought we would be there in the level that this particular slide conveys. So good for us, but got a long way to go. Next slide, please. This is the map. It's kind of a cool chart, and it sucks up a lot of memory, but don't worry, I did a screenshot, so it won't blow your system up if you ask for a copy of the presentation. But if you look at the light blue is the live systems, the yellow is the planned systems, the dark blue is a live but not really included in the report, like the Soviet Union. I guess it's Russia now, it's not Soviet Union. Boy, I'm getting old. The white are the planned, Egypt and Morocco and what the heck's that one in the middle of Asia? I can't even think of that right now. It's probably a couple of countries, the stands. And there's very few no schemes in place, but they're not really necessarily counting all of the ones that other people would count. But it's kind of a good baseline to provide a reference for where we are in this process. And then some of the metrics I mentioned on previous slide are up there in the extract that came from the American Banker. Maybe we have the next slide, please. But the faster payments, colloquially described as faster payments, are popping up all over. I was going to have a magician pull several rabbits out of a hat for this transition photo, but I couldn't find anything that was really good. And I thought, usually I err on the side of being slightly in questionable taste. So I think who could be offended by popcorn? May I have the next slide, please? So as you think about where these other faster payments, real-time payment systems may be coming from, clearly you see in the debit what I call a prepaid card remix, which is a sort of unconventional use of the debit card and prepaid card infrastructure to be able to support real-time payments. The account-to-account and open banking stuff is clearly making I think a surprising inroad, particularly in the past several months. P2P has grown up from basically an affectation to, if you look at the numbers that Zelle and Venmo are putting up on the board in terms of transaction volumes, the number of transactions, it's amazing. And they're morphing to the POS and morphing to small business and in other areas as well. As we've seen in our own work group on QR codes, accessing the cloud, QR codes are becoming the lingua franca of POS translation to real-time or faster payments. And you see a lot of systems that are going out there, including PayPal and many others, and I'll refer to several of them, that actually have the QR code as a way to get the transition going to be able to utilize a real-time payment capability. In the B2B sector and small business sector, you're seeing virtual networks emerging where the infrastructure is being assessed by groups that are collaborating to try and figure out, we don't necessarily need to change the rails or the core infrastructure, but we need to figure out how to get in and out of those, and who could be the facilitators to be able to do that. We also have digital wallets and accounts that have a lot of these payment capabilities that are kind of in their infancy, in my view, but are eventually going to be hosting real-time payment, and particularly account-to-account type and P2P type payment options. And if you'll notice, I bypassed crypto, and that's on purpose. We don't want to get in crypto. We'll spend a long time getting nowhere, and somebody's going to make a lot of money or lose a lot of money while we're talking about it. Next slide, please. On the account-to-account models, probably the one you may have heard about the most. Certainly, a lot of you have heard about Plaid, and they have a new relationship with Mazooma, and they're extending relationships to try and move from the screen scraping account aggregation model to something that's more bank transfer and potentially even POS type payment stuff. Trustly is one of the leading names in the guaranteed ACH, where they're able to essentially commit to the business aspect of a transaction in managing the risk for a fee in the background. But for many years, guaranteed ACH account type transactions languished, and they seem to be picking up speed, particularly in some of the new markets, organic markets like online betting and fantasy sports and potentially cannabis and other new organic markets. One of my favorites examples is App Brilliance, which essentially goes all the way to where you use your mobile banking or online banking capability one time, and from then on, you can use it any way the consumer directs it to. So it's not a screen scraper, it's a real-time live set of APIs that mimics exactly what is done by the mobile banking providers, and could be a very interesting user and bank control capability to be able to do transactions without anybody in the middle. The buyers and sellers get there directly. Another example of this comes from New Zealand, a company that's got a fintech that's got a lot of pizzazz behind it called Dosh, which is essentially, among other things, using a pay by a QR code, but adding out its payment capabilities going beyond the bank transfer. Next slide, please. There are many others. These are just some that I'm pretty familiar with. From the digital mobile wallet, the P2P, and what I call the remixed debit card-based payments, lots of big, well-heeled and notable players, as you see here, including the three from the gig economy world, the Uber, Grab, and Lyft. And I'll talk about those in particular because I think their message for financial inclusion is clearer than anybody else's. I think that's important to the Fed. I think it's probably important, it should be important to Faster Payments Council as well. But some big players are in the mix here. Next slide, please. This is one from Citcon, which does the Alipay and WeChat Pay and Chinese Union Pay stuff for Chinese visitors in the US. Well, they're doing a lot more than that now. And here's an example of some of the checkout richness that you can have at a lot of mainstream type of stores where you don't have to just use Alipay or WeChat Pay, but you can, if you look in the box in the center there, there's 9 different alternative payment capabilities, most of which people would view as account to account or bank account to bank account or real time or faster payments or near real time type payments. So the settlement, the actual cash flow, it may not be instantaneous. It may be in a batch mode or the like, but the business practicality of being able to accept the transaction is essentially anywhere from a few seconds to a few minutes. Next slide, please. So we had a discussion in the QR code work group a couple of sessions ago about, well, QR codes really aren't at POS, so it's not really something we should focus on there. And then I got to saying, and Maria and I talked about this, now wait a minute, there is stuff out there. In mid-August, PayPal announced its first grocer, so that's mainstream. They taking QR codes for both PayPal and for Venmo, but they done Williams Sonoma. Gee, it was probably close to 2 years ago now, and a number of others. So that's actually happening, and they bought a company called Paydiant back in 2015 that had a lot of capability in that area. Now it's coming to market. But even simpler still. So I'm at a restaurant. I'm there with my wife. It's in Cleveland, Ohio, where we're now spending about half of our time. We're out on a balcony overlooking Lake Erie in downtown Cleveland. And I forgot my wallet. We have a couple drinks, we eat our dinner, and I'm thinking, oh my God. And my wife didn't have her purse with her. And so my wife says, well, do you have your cell phone? And I looked at me and looked at her and I said, well, yeah. I said, well, because the only thing I really pay on my cell phone with is Apple Pay. And she said, I'm sure you can pay with something that you have. And I'm looking at her quizzically. Waiter comes up and says, and I said, hey, I forgot my wallet. You want one of us to run home and get it? And he goes, no, you can pay with your cell phone, dummy. He didn't say dummy, but it was implied in his eyes. And here I am, this mobile payments expert, or so-called self-appointed mobile payments expert. And I'm just not getting it. And he points to the receipt and he says, see the QR code there? Just take a picture of it. And so I go to my QR code reader and my wife says, no, just take a picture with your iPhone camera. Everything else will happen. And it did. And lo and behold, we check out, they got them. It's NCR system, scan, pay and go. It sends a message. I had card on file as part of my Apple Pay, which it figured out how to get and use that, and then went to the POS system and said, they're good to go. The waiter said, it was interesting. The first time that happened, he said, I thought the people stiffed me because they left without doing anything, but there's already a tip and everything in there. So don't tell me that the QR codes aren't at POS. Next slide, please. So now the financial inclusion stuff. You look at what Lyft and Uber are doing in the United States. A lot of these are sort of tricked out debit card kinds of things. But the way they're marketing it, I think, is really interesting. And it's that the gig economy is not so much trying to figure out how to pay as a consumer might, or to a merchant, or to a biller, but how to get paid if you're in the gig economy and you're not on a regular salary paycheck, automatic deposit, and that sort of thing. So this is a system that's powered by a company called Payfare and issued with Stride Bank. Not necessarily names that roll off your tongue in terms of familiarity, but it's designed to essentially give you economic security with no waiting. Next slide, please. And what I find interesting about this one, because I know a little bit about underneath the covers, is the approach is to say to people who don't normally have bank accounts, to them, instant payment, instant receipt for getting paid, and the ability to do access to ATMs, to earn cash back on your cards, that sort of thing. All that's, and to be insured, if you look in the middle of the right-hand side of the slide, up to $250,000. That's not a bad deal. It's a MasterCard, it's a easy saving rebates. This is stuff that I think is going to take depending on whose research you look at, 15-20% of maybe 30% of the population don't have meaningful bank account access or use a panoply of banking services. This could be really good. Next slide, please. So Uber has the same thing to a large extent, but one of the things I noticed in their website talking about their instant pay capability with a debit card is it doesn't always happen in real time. So there's some banks, and they happen to list them down at the very bottom, that don't pay in better than 2 to 3 days, and for quote unquote technical reasons. But the rest of them apparently pay right away, and you can receive the payment much faster depending on the bank. So here's another example of where I think the user is going to be a little confused by this. Why wouldn't all debit cards pay within, if you're a EFT network, 95% of that stuff gets paid instantly and the rest by the end of the day. But if you're MasterCard or Visa, maybe not, or Discover, maybe not, all this stuff happens real time. And so I think users who miss a payment or are unable to schedule or plan their finances very well may run into a wall. And the question is, how do we actually provide some guidance as to what kind of system, or should we provide guidance at all? What kind of system capabilities exist with these various iterations of faster payments, so-called faster payments? Next slide, please. Where I think the gig economy is really going is out in Singapore. And Singapore's very advanced in terms of electronic payments. And it's easy when you're a country that can give you 65 lashes with a whip for putting your bubble gum on the ground. That happened a long time ago. They don't do that anymore. I'm not sure they did it originally, but anyway, they and hopefully we're laughing and they haven't cut the tape off by this point. But there's the Maria saying, "Oh God, why did I sign up to do this with him again?" But Grab is the Lyft and Uber of Southeast Asia, and they're going gangbusters. But look at the marketing and how they're communicating what they're trying to do, including the financial inclusion aspects. Going cashless is easy. What you can use GrabPay for in-store purchases, Grab rides, Grab food deliveries, funds transfers. Just scan the QR code to pay. Again, the QR code. Next slide, please. But here's something I found interesting as perhaps a lesson. Next slide, please. There we go. So here's more of the marketing stuff. Transfer money in and out of your GrabPay wallet more easily. Why top up with Pay Now? What's Pay Now? Pay Now is the faster payment system of the government of Singapore. And what's interesting even more as you look at, if you're in the middle of the left slide, a box on the left, as we continue to look new ways to improve your GrabPay experience, please take note that Pay Now QR top-up will no longer be available as a feature in the GrabPay wallet starting the 1st of April 2021. You can still do it with a virtual private account, which can be your email or mobile sign up, but you can't do it off the QR code. And why? Because there was a security issue. They don't talk about it. You can't find anything that explains why they don't do the QR code top up. But I know people at Grab, and I understand that was the issue. So again, this is there's complexity in how all of this stuff's setting up, where the people who are on the periphery of the banks are using the banks for the legitimacy of the settlement and for the access to some of the financial services, the ability to use to get access through their mobile apps and that sort of thing. But we're all sort of exploring together what it is the structure ought to look like in order to protect the user and to ensure that you have what ultimately is probably going to be bank level kinds of security. It may not be the same blanket zero liability kind of formula that's worked with cards in the online marketplace for a couple of decades, but this is a lot of stuff for consumers to try and figure out. Next slide, please. I do like the private and public interoperation nodes. And over in Europe, in SEPA, Single European Payment Area, they have as one of their first rollouts the instant credit transfer capability. And what I like about this structure is it basically says there's a flow of participation that goes through ultimately and winds up in a settlement. But the Europe's focus is on trying to provide competition at every step in the flow, whether that's a payment initiation service provider, which could be a fintech, indirect participants, like peripheral kinds of clearing networks, direct participants, and even switches. So this is a service that is getting some good take up. And the idea, I think, is an interesting one to think about how the end users can go with the flow, as it were, of a structured system like this that is meant to offer not a unique but multivariate set of access points. Next slide, please. So we see on the B2B side, and particularly with respect to small business, that RTP, along with Zelle, as a foundation, has opened up a significant new opportunity to explore better ways to pay. And I thought Chase's view was one. It basically, to them, it was as opposed to whatever the concept of RTP is from a marketing standpoint. It's easier to describe it than what they want to do as Zelle for B2B. And if you remember, they had their own capability that had 18 million small businesses before Zelle came along. So it's interesting, I think, from a conceptualization standpoint, that the banks do want to market and do want to get at small businesses and consumers with this capability, but I think they want it to be lighter from a infrastructure standpoint. And RTP can be the rails underneath a lot more lighter implementations than perhaps what's available today or will be available in the next few years. Next slide, please. I've been working, as some of you at the FPC have, under the Business Payments Coalition, sort of a virtual network for e-invoicing. And here's an idea that I think is seminal to how we should think about, particularly B2B, for faster payments and real-time payments. Don't change the structure per se, but figure out where the points of access should be and who are the access point service providers, and how do you determine what their qualifications are, what their roles are. So this whole process, I think, has been very well thought through, and it gets at the idea that faster payments are great as payments, but if they can execute the business proposition faster because you've solved the invoicing problem and the paperwork problems in the back end, that gets you to a lot higher value added, which gets you a lot faster adoption. Next slide, please. And not just, again, continues to, I think, create a very different orientation, not just toward expanding same-day ACH, which is percolating along very well, but more of a holistic and in-depth understanding, as they describe, of Fixius. And Maria will be talking about Affinis as well as another new platform embodiment that looks at the challenges of historic payments and tries to say, how do we get at something that's more streamlined and that we can interoperate together and do all this stuff faster, better, cheaper, and safer. So I applaud them for the forward thinking. Next, go ahead. Next slide. This I thought was an interesting set of data on looking at not only the rapid take up in general through year 4, which is what most of the lines on the right lead to in terms of transaction volumes. This is off-net transactions per active account is the metric on the left-hand axis. But look how fast Australia, in not even in quarter 1, year 3, is just kind of exploding. And there's a lot of arguments for why Australia is doing so well. Next slide, please. But in my mind, one of the things that Australia did that was very innovative in and of itself was it basically said, all right, we'll do faster payments, real-time payments between bank to bank over a commodity network called the New Payments Platform. And there'll be gateways and the banks will be doing the security on both sides. But what we want to be able to do is foster innovation by having a plugin capability, API plugins called overlay services. And so at various points in the commodity network that has been built, you can plug in these overlay services. The overlay services can be developed by banks. They can be developed by third parties, by non-banks. And pretty much if you've done the APIs and you've addressed the security infrastructure requirements and that sort of thing, then it's up to the marketplace to decide whether anybody uses the app or not. And to me, that's the ultimate easy way to get to a competitive market. And there are other schemes that are also focused on this collaboration between public and private sectors that I think addresses, and that's mentioned in the box at the bottom right-hand corner. I think this is part of what we're trying to get at with this. We can solve the problem if we're all working together and there's an open market capability to succeed or fail based on the quality of your value proposition. Next slide, please. So in scaling the adoption of faster payments, on the left-hand side, a number of factors that could fuel adoption are listed. On the right-hand side, potential questions for the FPC. So expanded use cases, okay, should they be scheme-driven or market-driven? Some people don't like the idea of use cases, period, because they sound like somebody is, sort of plotting them as homework to say, okay, conceptually, users can do the following. What I think we really want to figure out is what users really need and are willing to migrate to. Expanded access for non-financial institutions. Who qualifies on what basis? It's not clear we have any standardized protocols or processes or comparative metrics to be able to do that. Innovative applications, can they just be done as network plugins because the whole world's going to APIs? Interoperability, how far do we go with this? Particularly if you're looking at global interconnections, how many? When? What if there's more than one in the country? How do you choose? Do you do both or do you do 3 of them or 4 of them in some countries? Mastery a new fraud target venue. Have we really understood the threats, identified the relevant solutions? Rethinking best practices for security, privacy, data sharing. Where do the standards come from? Can they and should they be embraced by the FPC? Or should we identify gaps that should be addressed? And incorporation of standard authentication approaches, which Maria is going to cover. Should the FPC be involved in authentication standards? And I'd love to hear the debate on that. And my last slide, please. And sort of the litmus test in our thinking, Maria's and mine, was expansion of fitted QR codes with faster payments. And it's clear you got to figure out what to do with QR codes. It's clear the rest of the world's going this way. It's clear all these systems are going to need to interoperate because you don't want to have to interconnect with dozens of different systems. Is there a rationalization process that could include a minimum and standard use of encryption, protections for dynamic data and links, and again, additional authentication? So we'll segue with that over to Maria, and thank you all. Look forward to hearing your questions in the end of the session. Maria.
Thank you so much, Steve. Great overview on what's happening in the marketplace where faster payments is concerned. I've been asked to pick up the mantle at this point and talk more about standards for faster payments. And before you hit the snooze button, let's just take a step back and think about why standards are important and what problem they're really trying to solve. For faster payments transactions, the challenges from my perspective are really what I call the 3 I's: immutability, irrevocability, and interoperability. Any new payment mechanism must address these 3 challenges. In each of the Faster Payment Council work groups, we've wrestled with the attributes that need to be built into interoperability so that all industry players can participate in the faster payments ecosystem. Immutability and irrevocability means there's no turning back, so you better get it right the first time. This characteristic of faster payments means that the industry at large must be developing safeguards to identify users, devices, and even the coding itself to eliminate fraud. It also means components like KYC, identity and access management systems, and directory models are going to be playing an even greater role in bringing real-time payments to fruition. There's actually never been a time when the need has been greater for a consistent way of doing things, and that's what standards provide. The backbone for the payments industry has always been ANSI, ISO, and NEST, but in some areas, they haven't kept pace with the innovation brought by fintech, neobanks, and other open banking players. Next slide, please. So we'll start by taking a look at what's developing on the authentication standards front. I have an American friend that's currently living in Germany and read an announcement recently that from PayPal that they were accepting transactions at the point of sale, and they were going to be showcasing that in Germany. So I asked her if she'd be a guinea pig for me. And she reported back that she entered into 2-factor authentication purgatory. She found out that she can't use her PayPal account because her profile was set up with a US phone that she no longer uses. And in addition to her email login and password. So the two-factor authentication scheme sent a code to her old US phone number, but she can't change the number on the account in her profile because she has to be authenticated first. So there are all kinds of things that need to be addressed, many challenges moving to the online environment when you're trying to validate who you say you are. And in the faster payments world, we need to validate the user, the sender, and the receiver to meet the requirements for that irrevocability in transaction processing. There are two standards bodies that are working on authentication. Next slide, please. One is the FIDO Alliance that supports online identity authentication for both mobile and e-commerce channels. They're big proponents of stronger biometrics instead of username and password, and they just released their newest set of specifications. I'm a big proponent of biometrics, but I do think that if we are continuing to wear masks, we're going to have to rethink the facial recognition at the point of sale that's now used when you use a mobile wallet. Now, the other standards body that's at play is WebAuthn, which is a W3C standards capability. It enables online services to use FIDO authentication through a standard web API that can be built into browsers and web platform infrastructures. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, why is this important? Let's take a look at what the FPC has been trying to do to support faster payments using QR codes. QR, from my perspective, is an enabling technology. It's not a payment type. And it leverages the internet to route messages or notifications to authorize faster payments. Next slide, please. This raises a question on the sender side about what needs to be built into the device to read the QR code, given that issuers are going to build their own codes with a myriad of functionality built in, some with a density level that may be hard to read. These standards will build authentication into the operating systems of their retail platforms. And to that end, FIDO has built their CTAP, focusing on the client-side device implementation. On the receiving side, the receiver needs to support the web server that fields these messages so they can be routed properly to the appropriate store of value. And these authentication standards will be propagated into the mobile environment and the desktop, as well as the point of sale. Next slide, please. Implementation challenges for our authentication are going to focus on the support for platforms and web servers. We're also going to be looking to make sure that they're supported everywhere, that ubiquity factor. And as is the case with my friend in Berlin, we want to make sure that there's sufficient authentication so that the customer feels comfortable performing the transaction and there's appropriate amount of risk mitigation, but not so much so that the customer decides to abandon the transaction completely. Next slide, please. Now, on the data sharing side, in the faster payments world, securitization of data is key. And under PSD2, which Steve mentioned earlier, customers in Europe are providing permission to share data in an open systems environment. To that end, the standards body, next slide, please. The financial data exchange standards are paving the way for open banking in North America. They operate in US and Canada, and they are providing an official standard framework for APIs in the US. These standards will give consumers better control over their personal financial data and offer financial institutions an easier way to share data securely. FTX is also defining standards based on user experience, again, considering those trade-offs of ease of use versus risk mitigation. And as next slide, please. FTX is working on APIs they've just finished their work on payment services infrastructure and have developed more than 600 unique financial data elements that cover financial transaction movement, such as bill pay and internal transfers. They've also defined securities specifications for end user permissioning for financial data sharing. Next slide, please. And then again, Steve mentioned AFINIS and interoperability standards building on the API standard that Notch has built and the IFX standard business message specification, which creates business data objects with defined data definitions. Next slide, please. The challenge here for data security is that these data sharing arrangements are going to be done using APIs. I also think that the identity and access management platform is going to be critical to facilitating the permissioning that's needed to support data sharing. Security is always a factor. The T-Mobile breach underscores just how important it is to have security wrapped around information like personal identifiable data as well. And we think that over the course of time, there'll be increased support for tokenization for both data in transit and at rest. Now, just a final note here, the FPC is not a standards body, but the work that we're doing in the work groups can really help to influence the standards that will be developed. FPC is currently in the process of starting a new work group dealing with APIs, and we're going to look to identify the APIs for payments that exist today by taking a look at what's on processors and banks' API platforms. We know that a lot of them are too generic for real-time payments. So our work group charter will be to break these down into smaller components to identify real-time payment functions, and then to scale by building business processes into those APIs.